Well, here I am. Here I am. I've come thousands of miles. So I want to talk about hope. Hope with type 2 diabetes. It's going to be a very practical approach because GPs are practical people. And we're going to think about how can we help the world. We've got to do something. We must do something. So how can we do it in a reasonably simple way that people can understand? So let's start with a wonderful patient. This is Chris. And there he was a few years ago on the left. But there he is now on the right. He's changed his life completely. Completely. And his story is a story of hope. And if we can replicate these stories of hope, we're going to make a difference. Chris was previously on multiple medications for his diabetes. He was obviously overweight, but look at him now. He's older, but looks so much better. Now, how about if we could do that for many patients? And how would we do it? I'm going to be talking about two different aspects of how we would start a new revolution. And we need help, psychological help, because so much of modern disease is to do with choices that we make. Everybody knows that cigarette smoking is a bad choice, but not everybody changes their behavior, do they? So we need to think about how do we change behavior. So something on psychology and the role of hope. And then also, I work in Southport as a GP in 10-minute appointments. And the question is, in a very short space of time, how are we to explain to ordinary people the role of insulin in diabetes? To help them understand their bodies and the changes that you're asking them to make. So that's what this talk is about. There's disclosures. I think it's very important that you know that nobody pays me to say anything. Or nobody's paid me yet, perhaps. You know, everybody has their price. So nobody pays me. I am a Royal College of General Practitioners clinical expert in diabetes, and I'm now National Champion in the UK for obesity and diabetes from the Royal College. So let's move on. But our story has a sad beginning. Our story has a sad beginning, and that is me, an old guy, and really, my story between 1986 and 2012 was one of increasing misery that many of you must have shared in, really. Who couldn't have seen the world changing, and who couldn't have looked around and worried, particularly about our young people? And I saw in my own practice, so when I started as a young man in 1986, we had 57 people with type 2 diabetes. And it was broadly an illness of the elderly. And I didn't used to think much about type 2 diabetes because it was quite rare. And they were older people who usually, they weren't so bad really. Fast forward to 2012 and we'd gone from 57 to 472 in the same population. So this cannot be genetic. I don't like the talk about it being genetic. It cannot. These people have not changed genetically in 30 years. It's the same population. It must be something environmental acting upon genetic susceptibility. But the point was, it made me very, very unhappy because the patients were so sick and they were getting younger and younger. And they were getting fatter and fatter too. Many of them were under 50 with type 2 diabetes. And at the moment, the youngest person I've found with type 2 diabetes is 10 years old. What is the future of that 10-year-old? It's appalling. It's appalling. And we must all fight this. We cannot accept it. We cannot accept it because when our generation has died out, who will remember the world was different Obesity was rare. So there is some urgency to doing something. But in 2012, I didn't have a thought in my head as to what to do, apart from I thought I'd probably retire from general practice and cash in the pension and do something cheerful like gardening. Because, escape the misery. Escape the misery. So that's where I was. And many of you will have heard me say before, but a single patient changed my life and has changed the life of so many other people. And this was the first patient I ever saw who had put her diabetes into type 2 diabetes remission. I didn't know it was possible. But she had used her diet to put her diabetes into remission and taught me a lot of lessons, some of which I'm going to share with you now. So I was very miserable, and now I'm very happy, and I'm still working, years on, so this is a story of that. Now, this is just some evidence that I have changed something, because you all have to decide whether I'm worth listening to or not. So if we look, here is a graph of quality of type 2 diabetes care in my practice against NHS Southport and Formby, NHS England, North of England, the world, okay? And when you look at 2012 or 2013, no wonder I was depressed, because look how bad we were, because up is good and down is bad. So Norwood surgery, there we were, languishing. It was such a miserable time. We'd had all our budgets cut. I'd lost district nurses, palliative care nurses. We had no money for anything. Certainly no money for diabetes. But look what happens over the years, and these are nationally collected figures, so gradually Norwood Avenue improves and improves, and now our results are far better than all sorts of averages. We're doing very, very well. Of course, the next logical question is, perhaps Dr. Unwin's doing this by prescribing a whole load of drugs. Why don't we just drug everybody? That would be a good idea, wouldn't it? Well, no, look, these again are nationally collected figures. And if you look, that's every practice in my area, and it's the prescribing of drugs for diabetes. And if you look, my practice is in the pink there, and we prescribe the least of all the practices in our area. We are not using drugs for type 2 diabetes. And in fact, I would say since 2012, I've only actually initiated drugs for diabetes on 6 occasions. Only 6 times have I actually needed to start somebody. This is amazing, and it's resulting in very substantial drug savings. So our practice spends £50,000 per year less on drugs for diabetes than is average. Of course, the pound is dropping inexorably, isn't it? I don't know how many dollars that is. It's probably about 50,000, about the same, I would think, a pound a dollar, something like that. Brexit, oh dear. Anyway, moving on. So we're saving money, and this is drawing attention to the low-carb way of living. The Treasury are very interested. So I've spoken in Parliament now on 3 occasions. I have seen the Treasury, because of course they're fascinated. But which country around the world can afford the drugs for diabetes? And on top of that, the results are so disappointing. In the UK, we're spending £1 billion now on drugs for diabetes, and look at the results. Has it been a happy story? No, it is not a happy story. We can do better. We can do better. Moving on. This is Roy. Now, look at him there. Before and after. He's so proud, and his wife is so delighted because she's got like a new husband there. She's so happy. So I want us all to think about, that's his graph of hemoglobin A1C there. Hemoglobin A1C, let's think about that as how sugary have you been in the preceding 120 days. So it's no good fasting on the day of your blood test, because that will not, I will still know what you have been eating. But look there. So I put the big question mark, because that was he came to see me, maybe was it April, something like that, April of this year. What happened at the question mark in that 10-minute appointment What happened to make him change and convince him that he should live differently? Well, it was two things. One was hope, and the other is an explanation of his condition. So let's just look into that a bit more. Psychology, the psychology of hope. Don't you think it's better that we talk about hope in diabetes instead of fear? For so many years, I used to think that scaring my patients was a good idea. So I talk about amputations and leg ulcers. And if you don't do as I say, you will, it's certain death. And it wasn't a great success. And there is, in fact, some research to say we shut people off by scaring them. Some of my patients wouldn't come back for years. And they said, well, I don't really see why I should come to be told off. Because that is what I did. I told people off and I was annoyed and, I threatened them. But I think how much better if we could infuse patients with the idea of hope. I think type 2 diabetes remission, drug-free type 2 diabetes remission, is a wonderful message of hope. And when I saw Roy on that day, I'm talking about, okay, you've got type 2 diabetes, but really what happens next, what future you choose, depends. And if you're up for changing behavior, I'm up for supporting you, and there's every chance that you will not need drugs. Well, he's far more interested in that message than he is do as I say, or, you're going to come to harm. People move towards the light, and hope is light. So it's really we all need to talk about this wonderful thing, type 2 diabetes remission. And we'll be covering that more later. But I'm actually now getting in my own practice, 50% of my patients are achieving drug-free diabetes remission. These are people who've been on a low-carb diet for an average of 2 years. 50%. And what's really exciting is that my percentage, I am getting better and better. You'll see my slide in a little while. When I did the slide, I was achieving 46%. But I reviewed all my work for coming here, and it's gone up to 50% because I've seen 12 more since I did the slide. So let's think really carefully about how we can do this and do it well. Hope is part of it. There. I said 46, but it's now 50. Hooray, hooray. So, back to Chris. Let's just have a think about his story from a psychological point of view. So, he came to me, I think he was one of my very first patients. So that'd be about 2013. And you'll see there, before the low-carb remission there, he was high. Now, his goal, what he hoped for, was he had various problems. The medication I was giving him was giving him bowel problems. And that was inconvenient and embarrassing, and he was hoping to get off that because he had a job driving. So his hope was it possible to come off the drugs? And at that point, I wasn't really sure. But I was prepared to give it a go, and at least he was motivated and interested. And he went low carb and did really, really well. And in fact, I wrote his case up in the BMJ. It's a very, very popular paper. But then, look what happened after then. He was written up in the BMJ, and then he drifted. And that makes a couple of very, very good points. The first point it makes is, so often I see that when patients drift, clinicians go, your low-carb diet is failing, and put you on drugs. No, it isn't failing. You need to look at the goals again, think again. He was drifting because he was carb addicted. He was having a little bit of stuff, cheating a little bit, and there was carb creep coming in. He needed ongoing support, so we mustn't just abandon our patients thinking you're now a success. If they were on drugs, we'd give them ongoing monitoring. So you need ongoing monitoring, whatever you do, because maybe you're going to drift. And he drifted. And we just had a chat about, he's saying, I'm a failure. I'm saying, you're not a failure. it's about your future. What are you going to learn from your position? Reframe failure. About what can you learn? How could you do Christmas better if that last Christmas was a failure? And he said, well, I suppose I could do what I did before. And I said, great, well, that kind of worked, didn't it? So he just said, all right, I'll do, yeah. And then you give them feedback. And look, the second time he did it, the remission was better and more sustained. And he is still improving. All these years are passing. That guy is still improving and losing weight and getting fitter. And now in my practice, he's a champion. He's a patient champion. And he's wanting to teach other people. So within the practice, he's gone all the way from being a sick patient to an advocate and a champion. And he's recruiting and helping me. He's a colleague. That is amazing, isn't it? Because I certainly didn't see him as a colleague. If you see the first one, I saw him as a heart sink. All right, a heart sink. And now I have such respect. Such respect. He's been on television for me. He's been on the radio. He's been in papers, done so much. What a story of success. And all his family are better. It's so, so exciting. Moving on. So for now, that's psychology done. Let's have a crack at physiology. So I think physiology is so interesting. And how about why don't we try and explain physiology to our patients so that they can make informed decisions, informed choices? So all of us together, we're going to go into psychology. We're going to look at liver function, triglyceride levels, central obesity and hunger, and type 2 diabetes itself. We're going to try and do that in a way that I could explain to a 75-year-old patient of mine, which I would often do, or a student, or an unemployed person. Let's try and see, can we explain things in an ordinary way? And then we'll easily change behavior because people make different choices. Right. A little bit of background. So, I've spent a lot of my life kind of mystified by things getting worse and not knowing why. So we begin here. So I discovered that out of 4,753 patients of mine, if you do the liver function tests, 24% of those patients have abnormal liver function tests. So a quarter of all my patients have abnormal liver function tests. And until 2012, I didn't know why. And in fact, many of them I told off for drinking. Because I thought, they'd say I only have a little bit, and I'd say, yes, but how much? Are you sure it's just? And I was so unpleasant to my patients, and I'd refer them to gastroenterologists where they got told off again. But can it really be true that 24% of my patients are all heavy drinkers, and are they all lying? That would be a bit miserable, wouldn't it? And of course, the answer is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. This is now 20% of the developed world. Another crisis that we hardly ever talk about. Another thing that used to mystify me was triglyceride levels. So again, many of my patients had triglyceride levels. And I wonder what the clinicians in the audience do when they get a high triglyceride level. I know what I used to do. I just used to fudge it. So they'd say, are my blood tests all right? And I'd say, well, yes, they're more or less all right. Your triglycerides up a bit, but we'll just recheck that next year. Is there anything I need to do? You could lose a little bit of weight. Does it matter? I didn't really know, Triglyceride, and yet triglyceride is central and so important. And we need to talk about triglyceride more, just as we should talk about type 2 diabetes remission. Triglyceride is a very important pointer. It's not a mystery. So how are we going to link? Talk of triglyceride and fatty liver and expanding waistlines and diabetes? How are we going to link all of those in a way that our patients can understand? I think actually we should use insulin as a model. Now, I may be wrong. I've been wrong, very wrong, many times before, but at least this is a model. So what I would explain to my 75-year-old patient is I'd say, well, if you eat a chocolate bar, your blood sugar goes up. And one of the problems with diabetes is a high blood sugar over time damages the inside of your arteries. But nature has designed you in such a genius way that you have a hormone there to protect you. The hormone is insulin, and the insulin's imperative is to drop that glucose at any cost at all because it's so important. So insulin is a hormone produced by your pancreas gland, and it has a job to get sugar out of your bloodstream and get rid of it anywhere. And in fact, insulin does that job by pushing glucose inside cells. That's what it does. And of course, some of the glucose is pushed into your muscles for energy, which I think most people have heard about. You do need glucose for energy. But what about if you take in more glucose than you actually need for energy? Well, insulin's imperative is to get rid of that dangerous glucose, and it pushes it, first of all, into your belly fat, producing a bigger belly, which so many people are familiar with. And then the other thing it does, it pushes the glucose into the cells of your liver. And after a while, the only thing your liver can do with extra glucose is turn it into triglyceride. So now we can understand, if we are a patient, why my triglyceride level may be high, because a triglyceride level is a reflection of carbohydrate in a way. If you have a lot of carbohydrate, you will get a fatty liver. And of course, this is the way some of you will have heard how you will get a fatty liver in a goose, which is foie gras, a funnel and carbohydrates. Is how you get a fatty liver for geese. But we are the same. So fatty liver. There we go. So that is triglyceride. So excess glucose gets pushed into your belly and into your liver. And if we just look here at a patient, an individual patient, there is the fasting triglyceride level, and over the same time there's the hemoglobin A1C. Look how that triglyceride level, which previously was a mystery to me as to what I could do with a high triglyceride level, look at that triglyceride level dropping like a stone at the same time as the hemoglobin A1C goes into remission. So interesting. And when you start looking for these patterns as clinicians, you'll see this happen again and again. Introducing another one of my wonderful patients. Now, this gentleman is 80 years old, and he's holding the tape measure around his abdomen where it was 2 years earlier, because he was a very heavy guy. But look, we reduced the carbohydrate, and his belly has just shrunk away. I used to have a prejudice about older people, and I used to think older people have a slow metabolism, you can do very little with them. That's wicked. That is terrible. Terrible. I now am an older person. So, you know, I'm kind of interested in older people. But look, you can do stuff. You can do stuff. So I'm illustrating. There's the triglyceride. There's the central obesity dropping away. And if, you know, just look at the speakers this morning. Where has it gone? The speakers this morning. We're on a low-carb diet. The belly's gone. Right. Oh yeah, low-carb liposuction. Let's market this. Let's market this. Cheap lipos. My patients were paying thousands of pounds for liposuction. Yeah, not now, not now. Here's another thing. A patient said to me, a very heavy lady actually, she said to me, Dr. Unwin, why am I constantly hungry? Because I've got months of food stored right here. So why am I hungry? And you know, I was always hungry until I was 55 years old. Always hungry. Where's the next biscuit? I'm watching my children to see have they finished their ice cream, because I could just finish it for them. You know, where have they hidden the Easter eggs? Because I could just, that kind of thing. I was always hungry. Always hungry. Now, why was I always hungry? And why the lady has a big store. She said, I've got a big store, but I'm always hungry. I think it probably, this is a model again, and I may be wrong, but I think insulin is to blame, because if the imperative is to drive down blood glucose at any cost, if you carry on having a moderate amount of carbohydrate, your insulin prevents you from burning fat, because insulin wants you to use glucose as your energy source. And while there's some glucose there, it won't let you burn fat. And I think that explains quite well to patients why moderation in carbohydrate has some problems. It has some problems because then you can't become a fat burner. Patients love the idea of being a fat burner. So I explain it to them in this way, that the carbohydrates will stop you from burning fat. The genius is we are dual fuel engines. We could burn fat or we could burn sugar. But if you have a lot of fat on board, you'd quite like to be a fat burner. It has many, many advantages. You can miss a meal if you want. I don't know whether if I have a meal or I don't. It doesn't matter. Before I couldn't even miss a snack. I couldn't miss a snack. And it explains so well the patient. The thing I'm told again and again is I'm not hungry. I'm not as hungry. Do I have to eat breakfast? Patients say, do I have to have breakfast? Hooray, no, you don't. Don't. Leave it, leave it. Is it the healthiest meal in the day? What? No, no. So, moving on. So, some of this has apart from being a Dr. Unwin anecdote, little chat, a little bit of science here, which I'm very grateful to Professor Roy Taylor in the UK. And he pointed out that as you continue to take in more glucose than you can use in your muscles, as I've explained, your liver is beginning to fill with fat. There it goes. And the disadvantage of having a fatty liver, one of the disadvantages, of which there's very many, is that a fatty liver is linked with insulin not working as well. But then you have another problem, because the pancreas is not the only thing, the liver is not the only thing that fills with fat. Your pancreas, look, in a minute, your pancreas is filling with fat as well. And eventually that gets to a point where it interferes with beta cell function and the production of insulin itself. Very serious. But a bit of good news, How about you reduce the carbohydrate intake? Reduce circulating insulin. These things can all go in reverse. And this is how type 2 diabetes can be put into remission. Because if you can empty your liver of fat, and if you can empty the pancreas, so many good things start to happen. Now, we have to be fair. Low carb is not the only way to do this. I think as a movement, we're growing up now. We need to be other ways to do it. Bariatric surgery is another way to do it, and it does it very quickly. Is surgery always what my patients want, though? I'd have a crack at this first. Before I went for bariatric surgery. Very low-calorie diets in the UK are becoming very popular, and this is another way. Roy Taylor is also getting good type 2 diabetes remission rates. So, moving on. Yeah, so I think it's fair to say that if you have type 2 diabetes, glucose becomes a sort of metabolic poison. And this is, again, the problem I have with moderation. You know, who's going to volunteer to be moderately poisoned? Moderately poisoned. No, I think I'd rather be completely well, actually. So I don't really want to compromise very much with glucose. So I find in clinical practice, questions are far more powerful than statements. And my wife, Jen, is a clinical psychologist, and she's taught me this at home. So much better that she asks me a question rather than telling me stuff, and vice versa. So a good question for your patients or each other is, where do you think your hemoglobin A1C is high? This is a reflection of how sugary you have been in the preceding 120 days. Where do you think that sugar came from? As a question, ask your patients. Where do you think it came from? Now, that brings you to, I think, the first priority for people with type 2 diabetes is to get rid of sucrose, table sugar, because it's got fructose in it as well. So that's a good place to start. But really, many of my patients are quite sophisticated, and when I say you should be giving up sugar, they say, I already did that. Of course they did. Of course they did. In the olden days, what would happen next is I would say, well, you've got a high hemoglobin A1C, and they'd say I'd given up sugar, and then I would be mystified why the hemoglobin A1C was high. I'd say, well, it seems high, and I don't really know why, because you've given up sugar, so there's nothing else to do. So we better medicate you. You know, we'll start metformin, and I say, isn't that sad? You know, I just thought, oh, you've given up sugar, that's all it is. And of course, that's where the patient came in, that one patient, because she was the woman that said to me, Dr. Unwin, you know, what did you learn at medical school? What did you learn? Because, you know, how about bread is sugar? How about rice is sugar? And, you know, I had to be reminded by a patient in 2012. This is awful, but how many other doctors need to be reminded by their patients that carbohydrates are an amazing source of glucose? And I can't believe I'm saying this, but it is true. I had forgotten, and I was routinely medicating patients who could just so easily give up bread. And I never mentioned it, not once. Easily in 10 years would I mention bread or even think about it. That still makes me, I'm still sorry really, if I'm to be honest, that it took me, I was 55 before I started thinking. That's slow. That's very, very slow. Anyway, so this is what that wonderful lady reminded me. Here it is, the starch molecule. And the starch molecule is glucose molecules, and they're holding hands. They're holding hands to make a big molecule, and digestion will break them down again back to the glucose. So I became fascinated, after that case, I became fascinated by the glycemic index, because actually carbohydrates vary in how sugary they are. They vary a lot. So the carbohydrate that makes up cornflakes or rice is much worse than the carbohydrate that makes up bread. They vary. And the glycemic index predicts the sugariness of different carbohydrates. And from the glycemic index, you go to another thing called the glycemic load, which tells you how many grams of glucose, equivalent really, a portion of food will deliver to your bloodstream. But I had a problem, because I was now fascinated and hooked on the glycemic index and the glycemic load, because it's so interesting, so very, very interesting. And I was trying to fascinate everybody I knew with the glycemic index and the glycemic load. And it didn't go well, because people, after a while, become very bored with talk, you know, and one of my partners called Cotty Schultz, a lovely lady doctor, and she's brutally honest. And she said one day, David, you're becoming very, very boring. We're not really interested in the glycemic index or the glycemic load. And you seem to, it's good, but you know, you've got to do something about this, because the patients are not getting it. They are not getting it. You need to really find a way of communicating this with our ordinary patients. And I'm so grateful to Cotty, because she was right. I hadn't understood that we must start communicating in 10 minutes in a way that people understand. And I worked out that the problem was, there were two problems. One is that patients in Southport never use glucose as a cooking. They don't know what it looks like. They have no concept of what glucose is, and in fact no interest in it. Also, they can't think in, what is 16 grams? What does it look like? They've no idea. So I had two problems. And I came up with probably the only idea I've had in my entire life. One idea. And that was, could you reinterpret the glycemic load in terms of teaspoons of sugar? Because my patients definitely get teaspoons of sugar. We're all using them every day. And this is where there's an Australian link. There is an Australian link. And that is that I contacted Jenny Brand-Miller in Sydney and said, have you got an expert on the glycemic index that would help me. And she suggested Dr. Geoffrey Leavesey in the UK, who actually helped her originally develop the glycemic load. And Geoffrey, bless him, did all the calculations, again, of 800 foods in terms of teaspoons of sugar. And what we see now on the slide is teaspoons of sugar of some common foods to make an infographic that I use to help my patients understand the consequences of their dietary choices. So, a small bowl of white rice, 150 grams, is the same in terms of your blood glucose as 10 teaspoons of sugar. So it's pretty obvious that white rice is not a great choice if you have diabetes and you care about your future. A potato, a baked potato, I always thought that was a slimming kind of a food, a baked potato with tuna. No, it's not a slimming food. You know, it's about 8 teaspoons of sugar easy. Well, my personal hatred for bananas is well known. Bananas, I hate bananas. They're sugar sticks. Don't have them. A banana, a ripe banana, is about the same as 5 or 6 teaspoons of sugar, so it's not a great idea. And yes, there's potassium in a banana, but please, there's potassium in other things as well. Right, so there's the infograms, and I did the infograms, and now there are 7 of them. And the good news is, after 2 years of burrowing away, I managed to bring about more acceptance of my infograms. And in the UK, NICE are in charge of all the guidelines and the standards. They are very, very important in the UK. And this February, my infograms were shortlisted for a NICE prize and have now been linked, actually linked, to the type 2 diabetes guidelines for adults in the UK. So that in the UK, thank you. So that in the UK, all healthcare professionals can use my infograms with complete impunity because they are recognised as an entirely useful source of information to give people with type 2 diabetes. And if any of you are interested to get my infograms, all you need to do is Google NICE, sugar and Unwin, and there are 7 of them. None of them are copyrighted. I'd just love it if you used them. I'd love it if you used them. And I'm showing off here, of course, because there is the Minister of Health, our own Minister of Health, Matt Hancock. And earlier this year, I managed to, so the Daily Mail are our most popular paper, and they featured my work as a sort of pull-out every day for a week. So I had 30 pages in the Daily Mail of recipes and physiology. Who would believe you could get physiology into the Daily Mail? Yeah. But if we try and communicate in a way that ordinary people understand, they do care. People are interested. It's the way, if they don't get it, it's perhaps our fault. We need to really think about how we communicate. And if the Daily Mail will do that, and they've done it again, only 2 weeks ago, and they want a 3rd one next year. So this caused the politicians, because they're very sensitive to the media. So I get a call from Matt Hancock's aide. Would I like to go to Parliament? Would I like to go to Parliament? Yes, I'm coming. He was so fair, he was so lovely, he loves my infograms, and he posed there with my infograms for me to put on Twitter. That's the Minister of Health, and the next day he gave my infograms to every member of his staff in the ministry. So we can do stuff, but it requires the media, it requires politicians, it requires us all to work together. And there is goodwill. Politicians, you know, they want to do good, really. Matt Hancock's a lovely guy. He isn't happy about diabetes and obesity. He isn't happy about that. But we have to help him a little. We have to help him. And the media helped him because of the interest. So, moving on. Just another one of the infograms. I've become very sensitive to the idea of fruit and veg are healthy. 5 a day, fruit and veg. Drives me insane, because how is a potato like cabbage? Or how is a potato like a strawberry? Or fruit and veg, you're 5 a day? It's driving me mad. We really must be more discerning than that. And so I do the infograms just to again, your choices. Why don't you have cabbage or green stuff? Or if you're going to have if you're going to have fruit, please don't have raisins. My patients is so interesting when you find people whose hemoglobin A1C isn't dropping and they don't know, and you find they're having healthy raisins or bananas or grapes or orange juice. It's really useful to pursue relentlessly where that sugar may be coming from. And I've tried to feature within the infographics common areas that I find is where patients are accidentally consuming sugar. Right, so we all like to be a bit sciencey, and I was challenged a lot in the early days, and so I put on a Freestyle Libre to monitor my own blood glucose. And you see there my own glucose tracing, and look how flat it is day after day, nothing's going on. And then one Friday morning, I ate the banana you see there, a single banana. And yes, look, hooray, it doubled my blood glucose. One banana. So this is choice. Okay, Dr. Unwin, you can have a flat trace, or you can enjoy a banana. Have a banana if you want, but take the consequences. You know, there is the consequence. And we had a lot of fun on Twitter. I hope some of you follow me on Twitter, low-carb-GP. Please follow me, because it helps politically, you see, because the more followers I have, the more the politicians think, oh, well, you know, I suppose we better listen to him a little. Really. So on Twitter we had a lot of fun. What do you want Dr. Unwin to eat? And they were all voting. Oh, I want him to eat a banana. Had to eat a bowl of rice. After 2 weeks I was quite ill, so I had to... my wife said, David, please stop this nonsense. No. The next thing is keeping things simple. You don't have to read all of that, but that is the diet sheet that I use in the practice, because again my patients said, can you just keep it simple please? So that's our standard diet sheet at Norwood Avenue that we've been using since 2013, and it kind of boils down. I don't really like to talk about grams or weighing. In fact, I never do. I never talk about portion size or grams, because I think a diet isn't a very healthy thing. A diet is a thing you're on because of a problem, and a lifestyle is something you wish to do because you're voting for your future. And one of my patients, somebody called Elizabeth, said, Dr. Unwin, you should be talking lifestyle, not diets. And I haven't needed to talk about grams. So I'm often asked about grams, but I don't actually, in clinical practice, I haven't needed to do that because my patients don't understand grams anyway. So it's not a great thing, but they certainly do understand the idea of what's white on your plate, turn it green. Okay, so you're eating rice, why do you have green stuff? Those kind of things. Eating healthily, they get that. And that's the diet there. So, next thing, it isn't just about diabetes. So let's just look at the results I'm achieving now in Norwood Avenue. The first thing there is to look at the hemoglobin A1C, how sugary are my patients. And of course, you like things in percentage here, so I've popped that in there at the bottom. Look at the start. So my patients began with hemoglobin A1C of 8.6. I am not taking easy cases. I actually love challenges. I love the ones with high hemoglobin A1C because I'm so excited to get those results back. People in the early days said, oh, he's probably just doing easy cases. It's not. That wouldn't be fair. This is a case series. At that point, there was 128 patients, but of course now there's 135 because I'm updating all the time. And at that point, they'd been on a low-carb diet for an average of 23 months. I'm now up to 24 months because it's a month on since I did this slide. So if you look at the drop there, so all of the patients but 2 managed to make a real improvement. There's only 2 that didn't, and there must be reasons for that, but that's a pretty good hit rate where they're all improving but 2. And bear in mind, I'm now I actually get 50% drug-free type 2 diabetes remission. So I'm deprescribing loads of stuff. I'm stopping loads of drugs for diabetes. which makes you think they can't have needed those drugs in the first place. I must have started those drugs unnecessarily years ago, and I'm now cutting my way through them. But look, it isn't. In the early days, I had many enemies, and I know I've met so many of you here seem nervous. Clinicians seem frightened that somebody will attack you. And I would say, if you're frightened, collect data. That's what I did. I was frightened. I did think, they used to stand up and shout at me in meetings like this. There were people, what you're doing is dangerous. What about cardiovascular disease? There were very cross people. So what I did was start measuring stuff. If you're scared, collect data. Have a look. Have a look at what happens to the lipid profiles. And I was so surprised because when I looked at what happened to the lipid profiles, to my amazement, they improved. The total cholesterol improved, and it improved significantly. The HDL, which is the protective cholesterol, went up, which is why it's a negative figure. It went up. In part, it's a reflection of triglyceride. Look at the triglyceride level. On average, my triglycerides are dropping by 1/3. Who can say that what I'm doing is a terrible thing? Because we're getting hemoglobin A1C, cholesterol, triglyceride. The weight, the average improvement in weight is 8.6 kilos over 2 years. I couldn't have sustained, these are sustained weight losses. This is completely new in my clinical practice. The blood pressure improvements are particularly interesting, and I'll be talking again tomorrow about the blood pressure story because that is so interesting. But it includes, I am taking out 20% of all the drugs for hypertension and still getting those results you see there. So I'm taking drugs away and still getting better results. And then the gamma GT is a reflection of liver function. And the liver function improves really fast. It's so interesting, really, really fast. So just as I explained in the physiology, the patients understand their results because I explain that's what we're hoping for. So they understand, they become really interested in their own results and they want their graphs. So you'll see me on Twitter put graph of the week. There's one gone on this morning. Graph of the week, because the patients are proud and they understand and they consent to sharing their data with everybody because they're so proud. How about this, that we have proud patients? Isn't that great, the idea that patients should be proud? Moving on. I've tried to do things to help the world of low carb, and one of the things is how do we de-prescribe drugs for diabetes safely? So some friends and I got together, and this is a paper we published in the British Journal of General Practice, I think a couple of months ago, and it's open access for you all. Because, if you're going to start low carb and people are on drugs, you need to know what's safe and what isn't safe and what to reduce. So there's a paper there for you. Metformin is safe with low carb, but other drugs may be a bit more complex, so please read the paper. Evidence. Let's very quickly move on to evidence. So I got so fed up over the years with being told there's no evidence for what you do, Dr. Unwin. It's dangerous. Evidence. Where's the evidence? Show me the evidence. Hooray, hooray. So this year in April, we had the consensus report from the American Dietetics Association in April of this year. And look what it says. This is a consensus report. It's so important. And it says, reducing overall carbohydrate intake for individuals with diabetes has demonstrated the most evidence for improving glycemia. So let's stop talking about there isn't evidence for reducing carbs. They have said in their consensus report it shows the most evidence, the most. So we can use that. I have put that there specially for you all because anybody talking evidence could do worse than start with a consensus report. So we mustn't be frightened. We mustn't be nervous. It's a reasonable choice. Reducing carbs is a very reasonable thing to do for our patients with type 2 diabetes. And we are backed up at the very highest level that it is a reasonable thing. It's not the only thing, but it is reasonable to do. So we're coming to the end now. So this is the final patient again. And just a detail about him. We were talking, weren't we, before? So when he came to see me, like this, 2 years ago, His concern was that he was on insulin and he was worried about his driving, because his insulin was caught, and type 2 diabetes was getting very erratic control, and maybe he wasn't safe to drive. And his other thing was that he was struggling to walk because his gait was so uneven, because his tummy was so enormous. So his hope was it possible in any way to come off insulin, because he'd been on it for years? And also, was it possible to walk better? And look at him now. So he came to see me 2 weeks ago, and this is so brilliant. He was late for his appointment, and you know why? He'd been doing weights at the gym. 80 years old, he's doing weights at the gym. And look at him, a chiseled face. He's handsome and lively as a cricket, and again, proud. An 80-year-old. And really, you know, if we can do this once, twice, I've now done it 71 times. And I'm not the only one. There are lots of doctors in this room who have also done it. We should all be doing it. It's a message of hope, a message of hope. So, there we are. Type 2 diabetes is not necessarily a chronic deteriorating condition. Please don't say it's a lack of exercise. Because, you know, my average patient is 63 years old and weighs 100 kilos. So the idea for them of putting on Lycra and going to a gym and being told you don't move about enough it's not kind. It isn't kind. I find that when they've lost weight, then they'll start exercising. But again, I was telling people off and saying, have you thought of joining a gym? Or here's a leaflet. Here's a leaflet on moving about more. How condescending of me, really. Terrible. So, yeah, type 2 diabetes remission, we need to talk about it more. I think the best thing also, just to leave you with, is that improving type 2 diabetes with a low-carb approach can improve weight, blood pressure, lipid profiles, liver function, and self-esteem. And it's not just the self-esteem of the patient, it's the self-esteem of the doctors as well. Thank you so much. Thank you.